I looked at the front glass for maybe a second. That was all it took. I was already too deep into a stop that wasn't supposed to be on my route, standing inside a QuickLantern with a gray tote in my hands, when something in the reflection caught me wrong. Outside, under that hard white canopy light, my truck was still sitting where I'd backed it in. So was I. In the glass, another version of me was still at the rear door, dragging down more freight like the delivery hadn't finished. Same shirt, same high-vis vest, same tired bend in my shoulders. I turned and looked through the real windows. The lot was empty. That was when I knew Garrett hadn't lost his mind. The rule about the front glass had been real the whole time. That wasn't how the job started. The first 2 nights were about as ordinary as anything I'd ever done. I was 31 when I took the overnight route, and if you'd seen the job on those first 2 nights, you wouldn't have thought there was anything in it worth remembering. The yard sat on the east side of Greater Houston, in a stretch of low warehouse buildings and chain-link fences that all looked half-finished under floodlights. You came in off the Beltway, took the feeder road past a row of closed tire shops and a gas station that never seemed to shut down, and by the time you turned through the gate, everything smelled like wet concrete, diesel, and old cardboard. Even that part felt normal after 10 minutes. I'd get there a little before my shift, grab the clipboard, check the paper manifest, scan the keys out, make sure the handheld had a full charge, and walk the truck once before I pulled out. Truck 12 was a small box truck with a cab that held the heat from the day way too long, even that late. The steering wheel always felt a little tacky at the start of the night. There was usually an old coffee smell in there too, like somebody had spilled it weeks ago and just kept driving. "Truck 12's yours," Tom said. Tom Greeley ran the overnight routes like he'd been tired since the late 90s and had made peace with it. He was in his 50s, thin, quiet, and never in a hurry unless something had already gone bad. He didn't waste words. He handed me the scanner, tapped the clipboard once, and moved on to the next problem before I'd even signed out. The route was for QuickLantern, one of those convenience chains that sit half between a neighborhood store and a gas station stop. Most of my night was feeder roads, access roads, and commercial strips off the Beltway on the east side of the city, with a few dead little retail pockets tucked behind older stations and dark parking lots. You learned the backsides of places more than the fronts. Loading doors, dumpster gates, which stores kept the rear light burned out, which ones wanted you to knock first even if they were expecting you. Night 1 was all work and no surprises. I backed into a rear slot behind a QuickLantern off the feeder, dropped 2 beverage totes and a cigarette crate, got a signature, and moved on. The next stop was in a dying strip mall where every storefront was dark except the one I was there for. Then another by a gas station canopy so bright it made the rest of the lot look black. I scanned, counted, unloaded, checked the paper, checked the handheld, pulled back out, and kept going. By 12 a.m., the shirt under my vest was damp at the collar. By 1:30 a.m., my hands already smelled like cardboard and cooler air. Around 2 a.m., I was drinking warm water from a bottle that had been rolling around on the passenger seat since the yard. That was the job. Freight and back, paper on the seat, scanner in hand, Beltway to feeder road to side lot to loading door. It wasn't glamorous, but it made sense. I liked that more than I probably should have. That route had belonged to Garrett before me. I'm not going deep into that yet. At that point, it was just a fact sitting in the cab with me, same as the clipboard and the scanner. Night 2 wasn't much different. Same yard, same humid air hanging under the floodlights, same feeling of your body not being fully awake yet, while your hands were already doing the work. I checked the manifest, counted the totes, made sure the dolly wheels weren't sticking, and started loading my pockets the same way I had the night before. Pen, flashlight, spare gloves. Tom stopped me before I headed out. "Paper copy matters more than the scanner if they stop matching," he told me. That didn't sound strange enough to stick right then. Systems got out of sync, drivers missed scans, dispatch updated things late, stuff happened. I just nodded and clipped the manifest back to the board. Night 2 ran clean too, a little slower in spots but clean. One store had me waiting at the back longer than I should have because the clerk was in the restroom. Another had a jammed rear latch that made me shoulder the door twice before it opened. I remember a strip of dead storefronts with one liquor sign still glowing in a window that had paper over half of it. I remember the air behind one QuickLantern smelling like hot asphalt and freezer burn. I remember seeing my own face in the side mirror at a red light and looking more tired than I felt. Nothing happened. That's the point. If the route had stayed like that, I would have kept driving it and never told this story at all. The first 2 nights were just work. Just Houston after midnight, just a small truck moving store freight through humid air and white gas station light until the city started feeling bigger than it did in the daytime. That was all it was then. Or that was all I thought it was. A couple nights in, the job was already starting to make sense in my hands. That's the thing about work like that. It doesn't stay abstract for long. After a couple runs, your body starts sorting it before your brain does. You stop thinking in full sentences. You think in little checks, scan the stop, match the store number, back into the rear if there's room, watch the dumpster gates, set the brake, grab the dolly, count what's coming off the truck against what's on the paper before you ever trust what the handheld says. The scanner mattered, but the paper mattered more. The paper manifest was simple. Store number, address, item count, notes if there were any, cigarettes separate, knock first, bad loading angle, stuff like that. If the paper and the scanner agreed, the night stayed clean. By night 2, I was already learning the little things nobody explained unless you asked. One rear door stuck at the top. One store wanted the cigarette crate counted separate. One back lot was dark enough that you kept the engine running while you unloaded. Stuff like that. Small things. Real things. That was why I didn't scare easy. I wasn't the kind of guy who took one odd sound in the dark and built a whole story around it. If something felt off, I looked for the reason first. Bad latch, late dispatch update, somebody entered the wrong store code. I always figured there was an explanation, and most of the time there was. Garrett had been like that too. He'd run that route before me. Same yard, same stores, same beltway and feeder roads and backlots behind gas stations where the white canopy light never quite reached the loading door. Then something happened, and after that, nobody in the family talked about it right. They used softer words than they should have, which somehow made it worse. They said he was worn down, said nights got to him, said he needed to get his head straight, like he'd just let the job get bigger than it was. I hated that. Garrett wasn't fragile. He wasn't dramatic. He was the kind of guy who could work a double, come home, sleep 4 hours, and still remember which store manager shorted him a signature 3 weeks earlier. If he said a route wasn't right, that should have meant something. Instead, it got folded into this cleaner version people could live with. A few nights before I started, I'd gone by his place and asked him about it. "You still running nights?" I asked Garrett. He took a second before answering. "Not that route." "Why?" I asked. He didn't answer me then. Not really. Just rubbed his thumb along the side of his coffee cup and looked past me like there was something outside the kitchen window worth more attention than I was giving him. I remember getting irritated with him. I remember thinking if he was trying to warn me, then warn me. If he wasn't, then don't do that half-step thing where you act like something matters but won't say it out loud. Later, after I'd already taken the route, I remembered an older call from him I hadn't thought much about at the time. He'd sounded tired. More than tired, really. Like he'd been awake too long and was trying to keep his voice level. He'd said something about a stop that wasn't on the paper route. That was it. Not some long explanation, not some story. Just that one detail dropped into the middle of a conversation that didn't make sense then and didn't make much more sense after. I'd let it go because I figured he was talking about dispatch screwing something up, a late add-on, a bad update, something stupid and fixable. That was how I thought about most things. Stupid and fixable. So by the time I came in for night 3, I wasn't walking into it like a guy waiting for a sign. I was walking in like a guy doing a job. Same yard, same floodlights, same wet heat sitting over everything, even that late. I signed out the keys, checked the paper manifest first, then the scanner, then walked the back of truck 12 and counted the load by hand before I ever climbed into the cab. The paper was clean. The route made sense. I remember that clearly because I checked it twice. The first few stops on night 3 went exactly how they should have. I hit a QuickLantern off the feeder where the rear light buzzed so loud you could hear it over the idling engine. Then one in a narrow lot behind a gas station where I had to fold the mirror in just to back close enough to the door. I scanned, counted, unloaded, got acknowledgement, and moved on. Nothing dragged, nothing glitched, nothing felt wrong. If anything, I felt more settled than I had the first 2 nights. That probably helped. You trust a thing faster once it starts repeating itself. Same road, same freight, same order of motions with your hands. By then I knew where I kept my flashlight without looking. I knew which pocket the pen was in. I knew how the cab smelled after an hour with the air running. I knew how the paper on the clipboard would soften a little in the humidity by the middle of the night. Everything about night 3 started smooth. That's what let the next part get as far as it did. Night 3 had gone clean long enough that I stopped thinking about Garrett every few minutes. That's usually how it works. A thing sits in the back of your mind until the rest of the night gets busy enough to push it down. I had 2 routine stops behind me already, 1 more on the board after that, and nothing in the scanner looked wrong. The paper made sense. The counts made sense. The rear doors opened when they were supposed to. Clerks signed where they were supposed to. It was all steady enough that I started feeling a little stupid for hanging on to half a sentence from an old phone call. The 3rd stop of the night took longer than it should have because the guy working the back room was new and wanted to count everything twice. While he did that, I stood there in the yellow spill from the rear light with sweat drying under my vest and called Garrett. He didn't pick up. That should have been the end of it. I could have put the phone back in my pocket, taken the signature, and kept moving. Instead, I stood there another second, listening to the line ring out while the truck idled behind me and the new clerk kept dragging crates 1 inch at a time like he thought somebody might accuse him of stealing bottled water. Garrett's voicemail picked up, then cut to the tone. I almost hung up. What stopped me was that old irritation again, not fear, not some bad feeling I couldn't name, just irritation. If he knew something about that route and had let me take it anyway, I was tired of being handled around it. So I left him a message. Nothing dramatic. I told him I was on the route, that everything looked normal so far, and that if he had something real to say, he could say it straight. He called back while I was driving to the next stop. The road was nearly empty where I picked up, one of those feeder stretches where the stores sit back from the lane, just far enough to look shut down even when they aren't. My headlights kept catching the edges of signs and chain link and the backs of low buildings with no windows on that side. I put the phone on speaker and held it low near the wheel. He didn't start with hello. He just asked where I was. I told him I was still running east and had 2 more ordinary stops before the route bent back in. There was a pause after that. Not a long one. Just long enough for me to hear him breathing and know he was trying to decide how much to say. Then he said it. If a stop shows up after you're already rolling, don't take it, Garrett said. I laughed once under my breath because it sounded wrong coming from him. Not spooky, just wrong. Like hearing a mechanic tell you not to trust a tire because of the moon. That's not how dispatch works, I told him. He didn't look at me when he answered. I know. That was Garrett. Even over the phone, you could tell when he'd turned away from whatever he was talking to. I could picture him doing it in his kitchen, one hand braced on the counter, staring at nothing. And because I knew him, because I knew how little patience he had for nonsense, that answer sat heavier than I wanted it to. I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer directly. He asked if the paper copy matched what I'd left the yard with. I said yes. He asked if any store number had moved. I said no. He asked if any clerk had opened the back before I got there. That part made me frown. I told him no, and even as I said it, I started hearing how specific he was being. Not vague, not dramatic. Specific in a way that made it worse. He said if a rear door was already unlocked before I got out of the truck, I was supposed to stay in the cab and call dispatch first. He said it like that was something obvious, the way you'd tell somebody not to unload on a slope or not to pull a dolly one-handed down wet concrete. Then he went quiet again. I passed under a gas station canopy light at the edge of an intersection, and the whole windshield flashed white for a second. When it went dark again, I realized my grip had tightened on the wheel. If the scanner and the paper don't match, trust the paper, he said. What am I supposed to do with that? I asked. I meant it like a challenge, but it didn't come out that way. It came out tired, a little thin maybe, because that one didn't sound like graveyard shift superstition. That sounded like process, except people don't usually say it with that kind of weight unless they have already learned it the hard way. He told me not to unload anything that wasn't on the printed manifest, even if the scanner accepted it. Said if the count changed after I left the yard, it wasn't mine. Said if the back door was open early, I wasn't supposed to step out at all. Said if somebody inside knew who I was before I gave my name, I needed to leave the last crate where it was and go. That was the point where my skin started crawling a little, not because I believed him yet, but because of how narrow the rules were. Not big, broad warnings, little exact things. The kind a person only says if he's already seen them happen in the right order. I told myself there were normal explanations. Drivers talk. Store clerks know your route. Dispatch adds late corrections. Somebody forgets to lock a back door. People in night jobs build habits and sayings around stupid things all the time. I knew all that. I kept reaching for it while he talked. Then he gave me the one I couldn't fit anywhere. Garrett kept his eyes on the table. Stay out of the front glass. That one hit me harder than the rest because it was so useless on its face. At least the others sounded like rules you could fake a reason for. Don't trust late stops. Don't trust the scanner over the paper. Don't unload to an unlocked back room. Fine. Those had shapes. They belonged to the job. But that one didn't. The front glass, I asked. First trip in, don't look at it, he said. I waited for more, for anything. Some explanation, some version of him backing off and saying he knew how stupid it sounded. He didn't do that. He just stayed on the line breathing, and I had the strangest feeling that if I kept pushing, he'd hang up instead of saying one word more. So I stopped asking. A minute later, he told me to keep the paper on the seat where I could see it and nod under the clipboard stack. Then he said he had to go. That was all he gave me. I drove the next few miles with the scanner docked by my leg and the manifest sitting loose on the passenger seat where the dome light caught the edges every time I hit a bump. I kept telling myself Garrett had let some ugly run of bad shifts turn into a private religion. Guys on overnights do that. They turn little routines into laws because the dark feels bigger when you're tired. I knew that. I believed that. Or I kept saying I did. Then I checked the route again at the next red light. Everything still looked normal. That was what let me keep going. That, and the fact that the start of night 3 still felt like every other night I'd worked. Same roads, same stores, same paper, same freight and back. Nothing bent yet, nothing visible anyway. The route stayed clean just long enough for me to think Garrett had handed me a fistful of superstition and called it experience. Then I got far enough into the night for the next stop to matter. The next 2 stops after Garrett's call were normal enough that I started getting annoyed at myself for carrying his voice around in my head. That happens on overnight work. Somebody says one strange thing, and if the next hour goes clean, you start flattening it back into something manageable. I made a cigarette drop at a QuickLantern off the feeder, got held up for maybe 3 minutes because the clerk couldn't find his pen, then ran another stop tucked behind a little row of dark storefronts with one nail salon sign still glowing blue in the window. I checked the paper, checked the scanner, counted the load, got the acknowledgement, moved on. Nothing weird. Nothing that didn't fit the job. It was after 2:13 a.m. when the route changed. I remember the time because I'd just looked at the dash clock while I was sitting at a long red light with nobody else in the intersection. The scanner gave a short tone down by my right leg, not the regular scan tone, something softer than that. I picked it up at the next straightaway and looked down. There was one more stop in the queue. It sat between the one I'd just finished and the next QuickLantern on the paper route like it had always belonged there. Store number, address, delivery line, all of it clean. No red flags, no broken text, no weird symbols. It looked exactly like every late dispatch correction I'd ever seen on other jobs, which was part of the problem. It looked official in the dumbest possible way. Boring, system-generated, easy to obey. I reached over and pulled the paper manifest off the passenger seat and checked it at the next pull-off. The stop wasn't there. I checked again, slower that time, tracing the row with my finger under the dome light. The addresses before and after matched the scanner. The store numbers before and after matched too. There was just nothing in between them. No handwritten note, no late add-on, nothing that could be mistaken for it. I sat there for a few seconds with the truck idling and the air running low through the vents, telling myself exactly what I'd already told myself about everything else. Late update. Bad sync. Dispatch pushed something after I left the yard. Stupid and fixable. And the truth is, if the scanner had thrown me some address way off route, I probably would have skipped it. But it didn't. It gave me a unit tucked right where a stop could plausibly exist, behind one of those older commercial strips east of the Beltway, where half the storefronts were empty and the other half got by on lottery tickets, beer coolers, and whatever stayed open past midnight. It fit too neatly into the map. That was what got me. I took the turn. The road back there narrowed fast. I passed a dead gas station first, one with the canopy still standing, but the pumps bagged off and the lot striped with weeds coming through the concrete. Behind it sat a low strip mall, most of it dark. One end unit had the right shape for a QuickLantern. Same glass front, same cheap bright sign box above the awning, same side-loading access wrapping around the back. If there was anything wrong with it from the road, it wasn't the kind of wrong you'd catch the first time through. The back lot was half lit by a pole lamp and half swallowed in shadow. I backed truck 12 in slow, checked my mirrors twice, and set the brake. That was when I saw the rear door. It was already cracked open, not wide, just a few inches, enough to show a strip of dim stockroom light through the gap. I sat there with both hands still on the wheel. Garrett's voice came back so clearly it irritated me all over again. If the back door's already unlocked, stay in the cab and call dispatch. I almost did it. I actually reached for the phone. Then I looked at the scanner again, looked at the store number, looked at the sign on the building, and talked myself out of it. Maybe the clerk had seen my headlights. Maybe he'd opened up early to save time. Maybe this was exactly the kind of thing guys turn into rules because they work too many nights and start giving ordinary mistakes more meaning than they deserve. I killed that thought halfway through because I knew I was forcing it, but I got out anyway. The air back there felt warmer than it should have. Still, not a hint of breeze. I grabbed the handheld, climbed into the box, and started sorting what belonged to that stop. Cases of drinks, a cigarette crate, 2 standard black totes. Then I saw the gray one. It was a hard plastic tote scuffed up along the corners with a white label on the side, printed in the same block format as the rest of the route stickers. Store number at the top, routing code under it, no product description, which I noticed right away because there was usually at least some shorthand telling you what family it belonged to. This one just looked thin, like part of the label had been left off. I checked the paper again under the cargo light. No gray tote. I checked the scanner. The scanner accepted it for that stop. I stood there, holding the thing in both hands, feeling the plastic handles bite into my fingers, and for a second, I just stared at the confirmation on the screen like I could make it change by waiting. The truck gave a little engine shiver through the floor under me. Somewhere off by the road, a loose sign tapped once in the dark. I should have left it there. I know that now. At the time, I did what people do when they are one bad decision away from the story they're going to tell later. I split it in half and tried to make only the convenient half matter. The paper was right, maybe, or the scanner was right, but the tote was physically in my truck, and the stop was physically on the handheld, and I was standing in a real loading bay behind what looked like a real store. That was enough to keep me moving. I took the first load down. The stockroom light inside was low and flat, not dark enough to hide in and not bright enough to feel clean. Shelving along one wall, cooler hum somewhere deeper in. I kept my eyes down and stayed with the back area, more focused on the floor and the hand truck and the stacks near the receiving side than anything else. I did not look toward the front of the store, not because I believed Garrett yet, just because he'd said it, and the thought was there now. I scanned the first items in, all accepted. I went back for the gray tote. The screen changed before I scanned the last item. The stop flipped to received. I felt my stomach drop in that quick, ugly way that doesn't feel dramatic when it happens. It just feels wrong. Too fast. Too early. I looked down at the handheld, then at the tote in my hands, then back at the screen again, like maybe I'd tapped something by accident. That was when the voice came out of the dark behind the stockroom. "You're early, Preston," the man inside said. I stopped with the tote still in my hands. "You know me?" He stayed back in the dark. Set it by the freezer wall. I didn't move right away. I could see part of him then, or enough to know there was a man standing there in work clothes, one shoulder turned toward me, face still out of the stronger light. Not hiding exactly, just not stepping forward either. "This stop wasn't on my paper," I said. "You still made it," he said. That was all. No explanation, no correction, no normal little backroom talk to smooth it over. I set the gray tote where he told me to. I hated myself a little for doing it while I was doing it. Then I backed out of that stockroom with the empty hand truck and the scanner still warm in my palm, trying not to rush enough to make it obvious that I wanted to be gone. I didn't look toward the front glass. I got back in the truck, pulled out of that lot, and kept driving the rest of the route. Nothing else happened that night. It almost made it worse. By the time I got back to the yard, I knew I'd already broken at least one rule, maybe more than one, and I still didn't have anything solid enough to call it by, besides a stop that wasn't on the paper and a man in the dark who knew my name before I gave it. I came back for night 4, telling myself I was there to prove night 3 had been a bad update and one weird clerk with too much confidence. That was the line I used on myself anyway. The truth was uglier than that. I came back because I hadn't slept right, and because every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gray tote sitting by the freezer wall where I'd left it. Not the tote itself, really. The fact of it. A piece of freight that had no place on the paper route and still found a place to go. I kept telling myself there had to be a clean explanation for that. Bad label, bad sync. Somebody at the yard moved one container wrong and the scanner followed it where the paper didn't. That was still easier to live with than Garrett being right. The yard looked the same as it always did. Floodlights, wet heat already holding on even that late. A forklift beeping somewhere past the loading bays. One of the other drivers smoking by the fence with his shirt half untucked. The whole point of places like that is how ordinary they stay no matter what you drag back into them. I checked out Truck 12 again, took the scanner, checked the paper manifest first, then stood there with the clipboard in my hand longer than I needed to. Nothing on it looked wrong. Same route structure, same east side run, Same QuickLantern stops stepping through feeder roads, old commercial strips and side lots behind gas stations, where the white canopy light did half the work of your headlights. No extra stop. No handwritten note. No correction clipped on after the fact. Tom was at the monitor bank with a paper cup of coffee he'd probably reheated twice already. I stood there long enough that he finally noticed I wasn't moving. "You ever seen this store number before?" I asked Tom. I showed him the number I'd written on the corner of the manifest from the night before. I'd copied it down before I turned the paperwork in. I'd checked it twice. I knew I had. He looked at the note, then at me, then back at his screen. He let that sit there. "If it's not on the paper, skip it." That irritated me more than if he'd just played dumb. "It keeps coming back," I said. Tom kept his eyes on the monitor. "Then don't help it." He said it flat, like it was a practical answer to a practical problem, and went back to whatever dispatch screens he was watching. No explanation, no surprise, no clean denial either. Just enough to tell me the number hadn't landed on him as total nonsense. That stayed with me harder than I wanted it to. I got out of the yard with the paper manifest on the passenger seat again, not clipped under anything, just the way Garrett had told me. That felt stupid too. Not because it made the paper wrong, but because I could hear myself following instructions I had already been telling myself I didn't believe in. The first part of night 4 stayed clean. That almost made me mad. I hit the usual stops, backed into the usual loading areas, waited on the usual clerks who moved slower than they needed to. One store had me stack the beverage cases tighter because the cooler guy liked to come in at 4 and complain if the back room looked sloppy. Another wanted the cigarette crate signed separately again. The engine heat stayed in the cab too long. My shirt stuck at the base of my neck. I wiped my scanner hand on my pants every few minutes without thinking about it. Everything worked exactly the way work is supposed to work when it doesn't care whether you're scared or not. But the scanner started hanging on certain screens. Not long, just enough to make me notice. The first time, it stalled while loading the next stop and sat with a little spinning icon longer than it should have. The second time, I caught the store list flicker past too fast to read and thought I saw the same number from the night before in the queue before it corrected itself. The third time, I stopped the truck under a dead strip of office lights and opened the stop list manually. Nothing there. I told myself that was good. I told myself that was exactly what I wanted. I still felt my pulse in the side of my throat for the next 10 minutes. The route carried on. The paper stayed clean. The scanner behaved just enough that I felt stupid every time I started reaching for meaning in a delay or a skipped refresh. That was the thing that got under me more than anything at first. It didn't break cleanly. It didn't go obvious. It kept brushing against normal hard enough to make me doubt my own read on it. The extra stop came back after 2:13 a.m. Same as the night before, it arrived softly. No alarm, no hard reroute, just one more stop placed between 2 regular deliveries like it belonged there. Same store number, same style of address, same calm, boring layout on the scanner screen. I pulled over under a strip of bad lot lighting and checked the paper first. It wasn't there. I checked again. Store before, store after. Clean sequence, no gap on paper at all. Then I looked back at the scanner, and for the first time since taking the route, I got that bad little hollow feeling that comes right before your body decides something for you. Not panic, not exactly. Just the start of your footing going soft. I should have skipped it. I know that too. But now there was something else mixed in with the fear. Frustration. The kind that gets you in trouble because it makes backing down feel worse than stepping forward. I wanted a mistake I could hold in my hand. I wanted something I could take back to Tom or Garrett or even myself and say, here, this is what happened. This is all it was. So I drove there again. Same dead gas station, same old strip mall behind it, Same end unit built in the shape of a QuickLantern. Only this time the place looked a little more awake from the back, and that bothered me because I still couldn't have told you exactly what had changed. The stockroom light reached farther. Maybe that was it. Or maybe the back door was open wider than before. It was definitely open before I got out, not cracked this time. Open enough to show shelving and a stretch of concrete floor inside. I kept one hand on the door handle and called toward the back. At the door, I called out, "You opened this before I got here?" Malcolm stayed out of sight. "You were expected." "By who?" I asked. He didn't answer. That was worse than a strange answer would have been. I stood there another second with the truck idling behind me, and I knew exactly what I was doing. Breaking the same rule a second time because I wanted the job to make sense more than I wanted to be careful. People talk about bad decisions like they happen in one clean snap. Most of the time they don't. Most of the time you feel yourself make them in layers and you keep going anyway. I climbed into the back and started checking the load against the stop. The listed freight looked mostly normal. Drink cases, a cigarette crate, standard black totes. Then I found another extra. Not the gray tote this time. This one was a shrink-wrapped case of energy drinks with the right route label format and the wrong life on paper. No line for it anywhere on the manifest. Nothing handwritten, nothing corrected. It did not exist there. The scanner took it anyway. I stood in the cargo space with the item half lifted and looked from the case to the handheld to the paper again. The same stupid loop like repeating the process would force one of them to confess. The truck's cargo light buzzed over my head. Sweat ran under the band of my cap and into one eyebrow. Somewhere inside the open stockroom, a cooler motor kicked on and stayed on. I took a screenshot of the stop screen with the scanner in view and the store number clear. Then, I took one of the paper manifest row showing the gap where that stop wasn't. I wanted something solid, something with time on it. I unloaded the first items. I did not take the extra case in. I left it near the edge of the truck floor while I moved the listed freight first, like that small act of caution fixed anything. Malcolm still didn't come fully out. I caught pieces of him only. A shoulder near a shelf end. The shape of a man standing farther back than he needed to. Once, the side of his face turned just enough to show pale light on his cheek, and then it was gone again. He never rushed me, never pressed. The whole feeling of him was that he didn't have to. When I came back to the truck, the scanner log looked different. Not wildly different. That would have been easier. Just different enough that my stomach dropped when I saw it. The stop still showed as active, but the extra item entry I just watched accept was no longer marked the way I remembered it. Same count total, same stop. But the item line itself had collapsed into a generic category tag like it had never been distinct to begin with. I opened my phone to check the screenshots. The first one was blurred. Not motion blur from my hand. The kind of blur you get when a camera tries to focus on the wrong layer of something and never quite lands. The store number was there, but soft enough that if I'd shown it to anybody else, they could have talked themselves out of reading it. The second shot of the manifest looked fine, except for one thing. The edge of the page, I was sure, had the gap in sequence now looked flatter than I remembered. Not corrected, not changed in any clear way. Just suddenly less useful, like my own proof had gone thin. That was the first time I really believed Garrett had seen the same thing. Not because I had a ghost in front of me. Not because I was ready to call any of it supernatural. I still wasn't. But because I could feel the shape of the trap in it. The scanner wouldn't stay still long enough to trust. The paper didn't move. But it wasn't enough by itself once you were standing in the wrong place, and the evidence I kept trying to hold on to kept turning slippery the second I got it. Dispatch was no help. The scanner was no help. Even my own memory was starting to feel like something I'd have to defend. That changed the night for me. Not a scream. Not something jumping out of the dark, just The slow, mean feeling that the few things I still trusted were starting to give way. I loaded back into the cab after that stop with my chest tight and my hands a little unsteady on the wheel. I still finished the rest of the route. I still made the normal drops. I still got signatures, moved freight, checked paper, drove the beltway back in. But I did it with the feeling that part of the night had split off and kept going somewhere I couldn't track. And I knew by then that if the stop showed up again, I wasn't going to be able to keep calling it a glitch. I stood there at the back of the truck knowing I should have left. The scanner was no good anymore. The screenshots weren't good enough to prove anything. The paper still didn't show the stop, but I was already in the lot again with the rear open, and Malcolm somewhere inside that stockroom, acting like none of this asked anything unusual of me. What kept me there wasn't courage. It was that mean, stubborn part of me that still thought if I handled the next minute right, the whole thing would finally show itself as something stupid and fixable. So I made one more trip inside. I took a smaller load that time, one black tote and the cigarette crate, something easy to carry, easy to set down, easy to walk back out from if I had to. I kept my eyes low as I crossed the threshold. Concrete floor, shelf legs, a strip of dirty baseboard by the back wall. I stayed with the receiving side and did not look toward the front of the store. I remember being aware of that on purpose, not fear, more like irritation again. Garrett had put that rule in my head, and now I was following it halfway without wanting to admit I was following it at all. The stockroom felt longer than it should have. I don't mean bigger. I mean longer. Like there was more distance between the back door and the brighter front section than there had been the first time I came through. The cooler hum was louder too, or maybe just steadier, to the point where it flattened everything else around it. I set the tote down where I thought it belonged, put the cigarette crate beside it, and took a second to listen. No footsteps, no register sound, no normal store noise from the front, just that hum and the little sounds my own clothes made when I moved. Then something shifted at the edge of the glass. It wasn't a person stepping into view. It was smaller than that. A wrong movement in the reflection, like a light source had changed position when it shouldn't have, or a shape had crossed somewhere outside without making any sound. I felt it before I really saw it. My eyes caught on it and pulled. "Don't," Malcolm said from somewhere behind me. I turned anyway. The front glass ran along the store in one dark panel broken only by the frame of the door and the weak shine off the floor tiles near the coolers. In the reflection, my truck was still outside under that hard white canopy light from the dead gas station next door, exactly where I'd backed it in. So was I. Not me standing in the store, me at the back of the truck. I saw myself at the rear opening, one foot braced on the bumper, body turned the same way mine always turned when I was pulling a tote from the far side. Same shirt, same high-vis vest, same baseball cap, same tired hunch in the shoulders. There was no blur to it this time, no trick of angle I could argue with. I could see the other me reaching in and dragging another load toward the edge like the stop was still going and had never stopped going. Every part of me went cold all at once. I looked away from the glass so fast my neck hurt, turned toward the actual front windows, and stared straight out into the real lot. Nothing. No movement, no person, no second truck, no me. The lot outside was empty except for the white spill of light and the dark shape of my own truck where it should have been. No one at the back, no one near the cab, nothing crossing the asphalt, nothing at all. I felt my mouth go dry so fast it was almost painful. My hand was still on the edge of the cigarette crate, and I realized I was squeezing it hard enough to bend the cardboard a little at the corner. Then I looked back at the glass. That other version of me was deeper in now, not outside the truck anymore, not fully. The truck was still there in the reflection, still under the same white light, but the figure wearing my clothes had moved farther along the line of the building than it should have been able to move in the time I'd looked away. It was closer to the open rear access, like it had already finished pulling something down and was taking it in. That was when normal explanations stopped working. Not because I had a neat word for it. I didn't. I still don't. But that was the moment normal explanations stopped even pretending they could keep up. Late dispatch update didn't cover that. Bad scanner sync didn't cover that. Tired eyes didn't cover that. Nothing I knew how to tell myself covered seeing my own body working a second version of the same stop in a piece of glass while the real lot outside stayed empty. "What is that?" I asked. My voice sounded thinner than I wanted it to. Not loud, just wrong, like it had come out without enough air behind it. He kept his voice low. "That's the part you weren't supposed to help." I turned at that and realized Malcolm was closer than he'd been before. Not suddenly close, not right in my face, just closer in a way that made it clear he could have stood there the whole time if he'd wanted to. He was near the end of one shelving run now, one hand resting against the upright, face still not fully in the light. I could see more of him than before. Dark work shirt, narrow face, calm eyes, no rush in him at all, no surprise, no fear. It was the same way he'd been from the start, and somehow that made it worse now. If he'd seemed excited or threatening, I could have done something with that. But he looked like a man watching a process run the way it was built to run. "There's nobody out there," I said. Malcolm let that sit there. "Not from here." That answer hit me harder than if he'd said something elaborate, maybe because it was short. Maybe because it was exactly the size of the thing he thought I was ready to hear, and no bigger. I didn't ask anything else. I couldn't. My body had already started making choices for me. My chest felt tight and hollow at the same time. The skin on my arms had gone cold under the damp fabric of my shirt. Every sound in the room had sharpened up too much. The cooler hum, the faint buzz from one of the overhead lights, even the drag of my own shoe when I took a step back. It was all too clear, which is what happens sometimes when fear stops being an idea and starts acting on your body directly. I backed away from the front half of the store without taking my eyes off Malcolm for a second. Not because I thought he was going to rush me. I didn't think that. That wasn't the danger in him. The danger in him was the way he didn't need to move at all. I got back to the stockroom side, then to the door, then out into the warmer night air behind the building. I still had enough sense left to know I couldn't go tearing out of there like a child. The truck was still there. The rear was still open. I still had freight half unloaded. I was still on a route with the scanner active in my hand. That was the awful part. The structure of the job was still wrapped around me even after the bottom had dropped out. So I climbed back into the truck and stood there in the cargo space for a second, breathing hard through my nose, trying to get my hands to settle. The load was unfinished. One black tote still sat near the threshold. The extra case from before was still in the corner where I'd left it. I could have forced myself to make another trip. I knew that in theory. But whatever stupid part of me had kept insisting I could reason through this was gone now. All that was left was the need to leave before I helped it any more than I already had. I pulled the rear door down, not slammed, just fast. I got in the cab, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of that lot with the feeling that I was leaving something behind that didn't care whether I came back under my own name or not. The rest of night 4 still happened. That's the part people always want to skip when they hear a story like this. But it matters. I still had stores left. I still had to stop, unload, get acknowledgments, and close the route out. My hands worked. My feet worked. I didn't crash the truck. I didn't sit on the shoulder shaking. I finished the night, but I finished it wrong. Every ordinary stop after that felt staged, like the route was trying too hard to keep pretending it was only a route. A clerk at one QuickLantern signed without even looking up, and I watched his pen move across the line like I was seeing signatures for the first time. Another store had a back freezer fan rattling loose, and the sound made me flinch so hard I got mad at myself immediately after. I kept checking the paper, then the scanner, Then the paper again. I checked the lot in every side mirror before getting out. I listened at every door. Nothing else broke. Not openly. That almost made me feel worse because it left me alone with exactly one thing I knew I couldn't absorb into normal life anymore. I'd looked at the front glass, and I'd seen myself still working a stop that, as far as the paper was concerned, wasn't even there. I got back from night 4 after sunrise with that used-up feeling you only get when your body's still doing the motions, but your head stopped trusting the night a while ago. I turned in the paperwork, handed back the scanner, and drove home without the radio on. I remember sitting in my driveway with the truck smell still on me, one hand on the wheel, not moving. My shirt was stuck to my back. My eyes hurt. I kept seeing that front glass every time I blinked, not like a movie loop, just pieces of it, the white light, the truck, me at the back door when I was already inside. I slept maybe 2 hours. The rest of the day felt wrong in the flatest possible way. Too bright, too quiet. I kept trying to reduce the whole thing back down to something I could hand to daylight and let it sort out. Bad reflection, wrong angle, exhaustion, some weird overlap in the glass with the lot outside. I said all of that to myself. I didn't believe any of it enough to feel better. By late afternoon, I was more tired than scared. That's not the same as calm. I went to Garrett's place before I had to report back to the yard. He let me in wearing an old gray t-shirt and the same look he'd had the night I asked him about the route the first time. Not guarded exactly, more like already braced. I stayed standing in the kitchen instead of sitting down. I think some part of me knew if I sat, I'd stay too long and start saying things I didn't even have words for yet. "Why didn't you tell me all of it?" I asked. Garrett looked past me. "Because you'd have gone anyway." That landed hard because I knew right away he was right. Not because I'm reckless. I'm not. I'd told myself that a dozen times already. But if he had sat me down and given me every detail, every rule, every bad stop, every weird piece of paperwork, I still would have taken the route. I would have told myself he was overtired and half spooked by the night, and I would have gone to prove the whole thing could be dragged back into reason. "You thought I wouldn't believe you," I said. "I thought you'd try to prove me wrong," he said. That was what bothered me. Not just that he knew me well enough to say it, that too, but mostly that he'd been carrying the shape of this thing alone long enough to know exactly how I'd walk into it. He wasn't warning me from some distance. He was recognizing the mistake before I made it, because he'd already watched it happen once. I asked him if he'd seen the same thing in the front glass. He didn't answer that directly. He didn't answer much directly. That was Garrett all over by then. Whatever that route had done to him, it hadn't made him dramatic. It had made him careful in a way that looked a lot like damage if you didn't know what you were looking at. He told me there was one night he tried to leave the stop unfinished. That was as close as he got to laying it out plain. He said he left freight on the truck, skipped the last part, got back to the yard, and still found the paperwork marked complete. Same route, same truck line, same signature field closed out like the stop had been handled right down the middle. He didn't say it like he was confessing something unbelievable. He said it like a man describing the exact place a machine stopped obeying the instructions printed on it. I asked if he'd gone back after that. He looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed when I was younger. Not old, just worn down around the edges, like part of him had been staying tense for too long without anybody else seeing it. He said he made the mistake of thinking he could fix it by understanding it. That was enough. He didn't need to say any more for me to hear what sat under it. He wasn't trying to solve a mystery because he loved mysteries. He was trying to get the ground back under his feet. Same as me. Same as anybody would. And the worst part was, sitting there in his kitchen with daylight coming through the blinds, I stopped being angry at him for not telling me sooner. Or at least, that wasn't the biggest thing anymore. The bigger thing was realizing how easy it had been for all of us to let the story of what happened to him flatten into something softer and less embarrassing. Nights got to him. He needed a break. He wasn't himself for a while. That version had let everybody else move on. It hadn't let him move on. I kept thinking about him coming back from that route and finding paperwork already completed under his name, sitting with that by himself, letting people talk around it, because saying it out loud would have sounded insane. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I'd turned his silence into a kind of weakness, because it was easier than thinking he had been telling the truth in pieces the whole time. That was the part that cornered me. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't pride. I just couldn't leave it sitting on him by himself, leaving it as his problem, his damage, his thing that happened because he couldn't handle the route. I couldn't sit with that anymore after night 4, not after the front glass, not after the paperwork, not after hearing him say he'd tried to leave and the stop had still found a way to close itself out through him. He told me not to go back that night. He didn't say it like an order, more like a man saying the last true thing he still had control over. I could hear how tired he was even then. I could hear that he wasn't trying to act like some guide who knew the rules of a haunted place. He was just a guy who had gotten broken open by a job nobody else believed could do that much damage. I wish I could tell you that made the decision easy. It didn't. I stood there in his kitchen looking at the sink, the coffee mug, the little ring of water under a glass on the counter, all that normal stuff, and knew I had 2 choices. I could save myself and walk away before night 5 started, or I could go back out because I couldn't stand the thought that Garrett had been carrying this alone while the rest of us translated it into something cleaner. I went back for family. That's the plain version. Not because I thought I was brave and not because I thought I could beat it. I went back because by then the route wasn't just some wrong stop and some broken paperwork. It had my brother in it. Not in a ghost story way, in the real way. In the way a bad place gets into a person's life and changes how everybody around him reads the damage. By the time I headed for the yard that night, I knew I wasn't going back to prove Garrett wrong. I was going back because he hadn't been wrong at all. By then, I knew I wasn't dealing with one bad stop on an otherwise normal route. I still checked it the same way. That part mattered more than ever. Paper manifest first, scanner second, store numbers, item counts, stop order, notes, same clipboard, same loose sheets on the passenger seat, same habit of touching the top page twice before I pulled out, like that could make the night hold still. The paper was clean. It was always clean. That was the first thing I understood for real by then. The paper wasn't the job as it changed. It was the job as it was supposed to be. Stable, closed, still belonging to the yard. The scanner was different. The scanner was where the route could still move. That was why Garrett had kept pushing the paper at me. That was why Tom hadn't answered me straight. The paper wasn't just a backup. It was the last version of the shift that still belonged to the yard. Night 5 started too smooth again. That was part of it too. The ordinary stops still worked. Clerks still signed. Beverage cases still came off the truck at the right stores. Cigarette crates still got counted by bored men in wrinkled polos under bad backroom lights. I still had to back into narrow slots and drag freight over cracked concrete and wait on people who moved like it was 2 PM instead of the middle of the night. But the wrong stop came earlier. That was new. It didn't wait until after 2:13 a.m. the way it had the first 2 times. I was still on the outer stretch of the route, not even to the point where the night usually started thinning out, when the scanner lagged and reloaded the stop list. The number was there for maybe a second before the screen shifted again. Same stop, same place in the sequence where it did not belong. My hand stayed still on the wheel, but everything in me tightened. That was when I understood another piece of it. It wasn't just repeating, it was pushing farther in, earlier, closer to the beginning of the shift, like whatever boundary had held it back before was getting weaker every time I let the truck into that lot. I pulled over under a bank sign that had gone dark for the night and checked the paper again. Nothing. Not just no extra stop, no space for one, No sign that the route had ever included it. That should have sent me back to the yard. It should have. But by then I was already too deep into the logic of it, and once I started seeing the shape, I couldn't stop following it. The paper was the route as assigned. The scanner was the route as accepted. That was the word that kept coming back to me. Accepted. Everything in that job was built around handoff. Freight leaves the yard. Driver confirms possession. Store receives goods. Clerk signs. Stop closes. You can do that work half asleep and still feel the structure of it because it's so basic. Handoff, acceptance, completed delivery. The wrong stop wasn't just appearing. It was trying to get accepted. That was why the open back door mattered. If the back door was already cracked before I got there, the stop was ready to receive. It was ahead of me in the process, already positioned for the handoff, not waiting for a driver to start the stop, waiting for one to finish it. That was why the scanner mattered more than I wanted it to. It wasn't making the stop out of nothing. It was the place where the stop could write itself into the night. The paper stayed clean because the yard never sent it. The scanner changed because the route, once I was out in it, still had room to be rewritten. And if Malcolm knew my name before I gave it, that meant something worse than I'd first let myself admit. It didn't just mean people talked. It meant the stop had already identified me as the delivery driver, not a man passing through, not a mistake. The driver, the one carrying the handoff forward. All of that hit me in pieces over the first few hours of night 5. Not in one smart thought, more like parts finally sliding into place because there was nowhere else for them to go. By the time the scanner placed that extra stop back into my route for real, I already knew what every rule had been trying to do. They were never meant to beat the place. They were meant to keep the place from using me to complete itself. Don't take a stop that appears after you leave the yard. Don't let it enter the shift through your hands. If the back door is already unlocked, stay in the cab. Don't step into a handoff that is already started without you. If the scanner and the paper don't match, trust the paper. Trust the last version of the night that still belongs to the real route. If the clerk says your name before you give it, leave. Because by then you've already been read into it. And the front glass, I didn't even want to think about that one, but I had to. The front glass didn't show the store, it showed the completion. The parallel version of the stop where the handoff kept going whether I wanted it to or not. That was why Garrett had told me not to look. Looking didn't create it. Looking showed me how far in I already was. When I turned into that lot on night 5, none of it felt hypothetical anymore. Same dead gas station, same white canopy light washing one side of the property too bright and leaving the rest of it flat and drained. Same old strip mall with most of the units dark. Same QuickLantern shape at the end like a store copied from memory by something that only knew the useful parts. The back door was already open, not cracked, not half open. Open wide enough that I could see straight into the stockroom from the truck, ready to receive. I stayed in the cab longer that time, hands on the wheel, engine idling, manifest on the passenger seat, scanner in my lap. I looked from one to the other and knew I was already past the point where a good decision would get me all the way clear. The best I could do now was stop helping. I left the scanner screen open and did not confirm anything. I took the paper with me when I got out. It wasn't that the room changed shape. It was that everything in it seemed pointed toward the same finished handoff. Malcolm was there before I fully crossed the threshold, not close, just present. Near the darker stretch past the receiving area, one shoulder turned, hands loose at his sides, still not performing anything, still not threatening. Just there the way a store clerk is there when he already knows what the next part of the routine is supposed to be. "You think this is a store," Malcolm said. "Then what is it?" I asked. He looked toward the dark behind the stockroom. A stop. That word landed harder than it should have, maybe because it was so plain. No mythology, no special language, just the exact word the job had trained into my body over and over until it barely sounded like language anymore. A stop. One more point on the route, one more handoff. A stop for what? I asked. Malcolm didn't answer right away. For whoever finishes it. That was answer enough. I stood there with the manifest folded once in my hand and felt the whole thing settle into place in a way that made me colder than confusion had. Garrett had never been losing his mind. He had just gotten far enough into the route to see what the route was asking him to do. And once he saw it, there was no good way to say it out loud to people who still believed a stop was just a line on a screen. I thought about him coming back from the same lot with freight still on his truck and paperwork already closed out anyway. I thought about Tom saying, "Don't help it." I thought about the scanner accepting what the paper refused. I thought about my own name spoken out of the dark before I ever offered it. The rules weren't superstition. They were the last few ways a driver could keep from finishing the handoff. The problem was, by night 5, I had already helped it too much. Once I understood what the rules were really for, the rest of night 5 felt like damage control. I kept my eyes off the front half of the store. That was the first thing. I stayed with the stockroom side, the floor, the shelving, the receiving wall, anything that let me move without giving that glass another chance to pull me in. I didn't touch the scanner except to keep it awake. I did not confirm the stop. I did not clear the screen. And I left the last gray tote where it was, still sitting near the rear of the truck like one final piece of the handoff, waiting on me to make it official. That was the only thing I had left by then. Just refusing to help. Not enough to make me feel safe. Not enough to make me think I was winning anything. Just enough to stop helping. Malcolm watched me from the darker end of the stockroom while I backed out toward the door. He still wasn't trying to block me. That was part of what made him so hard to read. He never acted like a man trying to keep somebody inside. He acted like somebody who already knew how the paperwork was going to close. When I reached the threshold, he finally spoke. "You made it farther than most," Malcolm said. I didn't answer him. I stepped out into the back lot without looking toward the front of the building once. The white spill from the dead gas station canopy still washed over the edge of the property, bright enough to flatten everything under it and leave the rest in that tired, gray dark you get just before morning starts thinking about showing up. My truck was where I'd left it, rear still open, the gray tote still inside. For 1 second, I thought about slamming the back shut and driving off without touching anything else. Instead, I climbed into the box one last time and stood there with the smell of cardboard and stale cooler air and hot metal all around me, staring at that tote like it was something alive. Same scuffed corners, same white label, same wrong feeling in my hands just from looking at it. I didn't move it, I didn't scan it, I just pulled the rear door down and locked it in place. Then I got in the cab and left. No chase, no sound behind me, no pounding on the truck. That almost made it worse, because it let me keep wondering whether I had actually interrupted anything or only stepped away at the point where I stopped being useful. I finished the rest of the route anyway. That's another part people expect to be cleaner than it was. They expect a story to know when it has reached the end. Work doesn't. I still had normal stops left. I still had freight to move. I still had signatures to get. The beltway was still there. The feeder roads were still there. Clerk still opened rear doors and counted cigarette crates and signed half awake with one hand while holding a cup in the other. The world around the route stayed ordinary right up to the end of my shift. That was probably the worst part. Because by then I knew ordinary wasn't going to help me. I got back to the yard a little before dawn with that numb, overused feeling in my arms that comes after a full night of unloading. The floodlights were still on. The sky over the warehouses had started going pale in the ugliest possible way. Not sunrise yet, just that thin gray that makes every building look unfinished. I turned truck 12 in, docked the scanner, and stood at the counter while Tom printed the closeout. He slid the paperwork toward me without much interest. I looked down, and the wrong stop was on it. Not handwritten in, not flagged, not floating half-formed the way it had on the scanner. It was closed out like any other completed stop on the route. Store number, delivery total, received, done. And there, right where the sign-off sat, was my name. Preston Avery. The timestamp sat above it. It was earlier than when I'd actually pulled into that lot. Not by a few seconds either. Enough that I knew, with the same hard certainty I knew my own truck number, that the stop had been marked complete before I was even standing in the stockroom trying not to look at the front glass. It had the smooth, dead look of finished paperwork. Nothing dramatic about it, nothing noisy. Just one more stop on a route, accepted and closed. At the yard, I held the printout and said, "I never signed this." Tom looked at the page, then at me. "Then don't come back." That was it. No surprise, no argument, no call to dispatch, no checking the logs in front of me like maybe we could fix it if we all stared hard enough. He said it like a man watching somebody finally arrive at the same wall everyone else had learned not to push on. I stood there another second, waiting for something in me to settle. Nothing did. I left the paperwork on the counter, handed over the keys, and walked out of the yard without finishing my coffee, without saying goodbye to anybody, without looking back at Truck 12. I quit that morning. Just like that. No notice, no long explanation. I was done. Garrett called me later that day. I told him I was out. He stayed quiet for a second, and then he said that was probably for the best. That was all either of us had for it. I never ran nights again after that, not for convenience stores, not for anybody. I found day work and kept it. I slept better eventually, at least enough to function. I stopped expecting the scanner tone in the middle of the afternoon. I stopped checking the passenger seat for a paper manifest every time I got in my own car. But the front glass never got right again. That's the part that stayed with me. From that point on, I couldn't look straight into the front windows of a convenience store after midnight. I could walk in if I had to. I could pay for gas. I could buy a bottle of water or cough drops or whatever else normal people buy under fluorescent light at bad hours. But I couldn't let myself look head-on into that glass, not if the lot outside was washed in white light and the place was quiet enough for the hum of the coolers to carry. A few times I slipped. A few times I looked before I could stop myself. And every now and then, not every time, just enough, I'd catch the reflection of an old box truck sitting under a hard white canopy with the rear open. No driver in the lot, no movement I could swear to, just the shape of a delivery that still looked one step short of finished. I don't know if that stop is still there. I don't know if it ever needed me as much as I thought it did. I only know Garrett wasn't weak, and he wasn't losing his mind. He just got far enough into the route to see what it was doing before anybody around him had words for that kind of damage. And some nights when I pass a convenience store too late and catch myself almost looking into the front glass, I still get that same tight feeling in my chest, like that last gray tote never really got where it was going.